Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Halo Sobat Literasi, selamat berjumpa kembali dengan saya Blantik Literasi, berliterasi setiap hari.
About consuming passion, the culture of American consumption,
about global lifestyle under local conditions,
about video dreams, television and cultural forms,
root identities in post-authoritarian politics,
about the Hollywood sign, the culture of American film,
utopian, dreams, semiotics, and the new media.
American makeover, constructing identity in the age of entertainment,
consumption patterns of the South Korean middle class and new generations, and middle class formation and consumption in Hong Kong.
The endemic world of the high consumer, fashion and cultural formation.
For consuming Asian ideas and issues.
Brought to you by Design of Advertising.
Hello everyone, we'd like to present and discuss a new topic in popular culture studies, which is consumption patterns of the South Korean middle class and new generations, and middle class formation and consumption in Hong Kong. Before that, let us introduce ourselves. My name is Almira, student number 24, and I'm not alone here. There are other friends, Gustilena Nur, student number 7, and Larasati Dinda, student number 35. This is the table of contents, what we will learn today. The first is introductions. In introduction, we will explain the background or the situations, the context of the South Korea and Hong Kong. And the second is historical formation of consumerism in Korea, social implication of Korean consumerism, and then the fourth is we will move to Hong Kong, introduction, and then class in Hong Kong, middle class, and lastly consumption, cultural capital, and middle class culture. The first topic is consumption patterns of the South Korean middle class and new generation. In the introduction, we will explain the background or the context of this chapter. Well, consumerism in all its diverse forms has become part of South Koreans' daily reality. A central feature of contemporary consumerism is the expansion of leisure activities which are integrated with consumption behaviors, such as shopping, eating out, tourism, and sports. Leisure has become not only a serious business, but also people's preoccupation, especially the young and middle class. Thus, consumption is a multi-dimensional concept and touch on areas of main sociological importance. For instance, stratification and inequality, the nature of work, social motivations, the organization of political action, social movements, and contemporary cultural forms. In this presentation, we will discuss the growth and expansion of consumerism, the characteristic of contemporary consumption patterns, and social implication of the rise of consumerism in South Korea. The first subchapter is historical formation of consumerism in Korea. A, the rise of consumerism. The cultural foundation of expanding consumerism may be rooted in the political and economic transformation of South Korea from a poor and repressed country into a democratic country. There was a change in South Korea's political situation in the 1980s from an authoritarian regime into a democratic country. It was blown up because of the mass protest in South Korea, which was called as Gwangju Uprising. You can see the picture there. It was a Gwangju Uprising in 1980. This political pluralization with its liberalizing and deregulating effects on people's social and economic life. And then it is added with a demographic explosion of the number of college students in the last 2 decades. Many of them are doing a part-time job, or in Korean is called alba, to earn money from, for instance, tutoring to younger students, being a staff in a cafe or store, and so on. Thus, it increased their consumption behavior. And people whose age are under 35 years old, like a college student, which I've mentioned before, is called a new generation. And some experts show that new generation view consumerism as a culture and ideology. In the other words, young generation have consumerism orientations. Meanwhile, the old generation, or people whose age is more than 35 years old, tend to have productionist orientation. There's also another different political perspective of the old and young generations. Most old people are being conservative and young people are being progressive. Well, it cannot be excluded from its painful histories. Korean people above 50 years old might be victims of Korean War and Japan colonial rule. They are full of regrets and tears. They also have unsatisfied desires and repressed and unhappy memories. In Korea, this aggregate sentiment is called Han, and it affects the basis of capitalism in South Korea, which is construct from the hungry spirits of Korean people full of Han. The next factor is advertisement and economic slogan in South Korea. There is a propaganda from the government, like a popular national slogan for economic development in the early years of South Korea industrialization. The slogan was, "Let's live a rich life in our lifetime." This slogan triggered South Korean people to emerge out from poverty. Just they really work hard and obeyed their government and company. And all of the factors which I have mentioned earlier lead to a thirsty consumption behavior of the South Korean. The next is the level and pattern Korean consumption. It is an interesting quotation. Capitalists make economic crisis but distribute it unequally. Well, this is a table of the growth of consumption from National Statistical Office in 1998, and there are increased rate of consumption and income. Thus, government put out all of Koreans to trade in their private holding of culturally from government bonds. And to control populations, the government encouraged the population to go out and spend money and not to save excessively in order to keep the domestic economy afloat.
Okay, I will continue the presentation. As Almira has explained before, the rate of consumption and income of South Korea has increased, and the capitalists made economic crisis but distributed unequally. Now I will explain in terms of durable goods. The more expensive is the goods or stuff, means the quality is better. And Koreans tend to buy products from Western because it becomes a trend. But high demands does not mean that the goods or stuffs are really necessary. In terms of leisure, a significant urban-rural inequality in consumption happens. In terms of tourism, there's a study travel to other countries among students that becomes a trend. And to compare it with other countries, in 1984 until 1990, 1990, there is a high economic growth in South Korea. Next slide, please. So how does the public perception of these excessive consumptions? There's an open discourse to critique the consumerism lifestyle. There's a discussion that excessive or blind materialism, so there's create a moral panic or ideological battle, and then excessive consumption such as children's education, entertainment, foods, it becomes a panic buying amongst the South Korean citizen. And there's the consumerism of the young, that younger Koreans become a leisure-orientated, while older generation, they were more to be work-orientated. In spite of the apparent financial conservatism with reference to cars and houses, the younger generations appear to agree with the general perception that they were more consumption-orientated than their elders. Next slide, please. Next, I will explain about social implication of Korean consumerism. Nationalist movements with such slogans as buy Korean goods, less consumption, more savings, or anti-Westernization were frequently organized by pro-government consumer groups without much success. And during the same period, those who preferred bed to ondol, or a Korean way of sleeping, had increased from 37% to 40%. And those who were critical of the use of foreign models and foreign images in advertisement had decreased from 32% to 26% and 70% to 64% respectively. Although some conservative religious moralists had been eager to declare spiritual war against demoralized and demoralizing Western cultures, for example, to prohibit Michael Jackson from performing, and then the anti-Westernism ideology in public discourse on consumptions often found in other developing countries of Asia had been rather weak in South Korea. In general, the cultural, moral, and sometimes economic criticisms that the young generation were imitating Western street culture and wasting money on foreign goods had been losing ground among South Koreans. Next slide, please. Correspondingly, the young generation may discover the self-liberating potential of consumerism, despite authoritarian attempts by some old and conservative individuals to prevent them from consuming new cultural items and practice. And without understanding the unevenness of consumption practice across class lines, and without underestimating the absence of self-reflexivity in most of today's consumers, it is nevertheless possible for South Korean consumers to organize themselves against powerful capitalist producers and distributors.
The second topic is middle class formation and consumption in Hong Kong. This chapter will talk about fundamental issues concerning the consumption patterns of a subsection of Hong Kong's new rich. The term new rich here refers to those relatively new wealthy social groups which have emerged during post-war economic development. In the case of Hong Kong, the new rich in the 1990s can be seen as consisting of entrepreneurs and businessmen, as well as professionals, administrators, and managers. And these categories can be further subdivided by age. Thus, this chapter will discuss the formation of middle class in Hong Kong, the relationship between consumption and class in Hong Kong, and consumption patterns and value of the new middle class. The first subchapter is class in Hong Kong. An expert, Lee, has argued that class is no longer a meaningful concept in Hong Kong because social classes here are internally fragmented, and that members of the same class no longer share the same interests and outlooks. The argument is a well-rehearsed one, since Hong Kong is an open society where individual merit is the main criteria for achievement. However, recent literature shows that there is a formation of a number of classes throughout the history of Hong Kong as a British colony. And the distribution of power and material resources has never been in any way egalitarian, and economic development has continued to widen rather than narrow the gap of the rich and the poor. Thus, it is the middle class who have benefited the most rapid and compressed economic development. The next subchapter will be delivered by Gusti Lena. Time is yours.
Thank you, Almira. Now it's my turn. We will be talking about middle class in Hong Kong. Middle class refers to individuals and households or people who typically fall between the working class and the upper class within a socio-economic hierarchy. So we can say that middle class people are people who don't belong to crazy rich, but they are not also in poverty. Two major factors which contributed to the growth of Hong Kong middle class. There are A, economic restructuring, and then B, links with the international company. In this table, we can see that there are working population in Hong Kong, there are manufacturing, construction, wholesale, transport, financing, business community, personal services, and other. We can conclude that from year 1976 to 1996, professional and managerial personnel have increased a lot. Next, please. And then consumption, cultural capital, and middle class culture. There are two major points here, consumption and leisure factor. The first one is consumption. Consumption is divided into two parts. There are consumption in public and private sectors, and then leisure sectors. The first one is high-level education people are more likely to spend their money for eating out in Western restaurant, reading a book, listening to classical music, and have been to shopping mall. And then low level of education people spend their money to watch football at home, betting on horse races, watching TV, and engaging in minimal physical activities. In this table, we can see there are accommodation, food, entertainment, children's education, transport, and clothing. In terms of cultural activities, those with higher levels of education have the highest rate of attendance at high cultural performances. 23 findings from recent surveys also indicate that consumption knowledge and practices vary along the lines of class, age, income, and education. Please next. Then, young professionals, managers, and administrators in Hong Kong. This is the qualification in Hong Kong. The first one is single, age 25 to 35, employed in non-manual, professional, managerial, or administrative occupation. Fourth, financially independent. Fifth, attend post-secondary education, common above average monthly income, and locally born. Next. Their motto is, in life is work hard, consume hard. Most of my friends would agree with me. A director and entrepreneur, social origin class 5. And then also the opinion from a photographer, social origin class 3. I buy expensive things sometimes, and definitely with no regrets if it's worth. If I spend $2,000 on a shirt, I want to make sure it's not made in Hong Kong or something. Make sure it's of high quality craftsmanship. Some people think that buying expensive stuff is always good, but it's not really. The next. Leisure activities. The most commonly reported leisure activities practiced by respondents are cinema going, eating out, and shopping. Specific patterns of consumption. These two tables shows us consumption outlooks and specific consumption patterns. There are social origin, outlook, films, eating out, shopping, and then it is divided by some or many occupation here. You can read by yourself. And then we can conclude that regardless of the profession, people in Hong Kong have their own priority on leisure activities. The next. Please next. Then reference, we got our PPT from these two books. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. If you have any question, you can ask in the class. Thank you and have a nice day.